There's a moment in every soul's journey when silence becomes unbearable. Not because it's empty, but because it's honest. In the silence, you cannot perform. You cannot manipulate. You cannot pretend. The masks fall, the titles disappear, and you are left staring into the mirror. Not the one hanging on the wall, but the one buried inside your psyche. It does not flatter. It reflects. And what it shows you is everything your ego has fought to hide. You see, the ego is not a villain. It is a frightened child dressed in armor, shouting to be seen, desperate not to be forgotten. It builds thrones out of insecurity. It wears arrogance like a cloak. It chases power not to rule the world, but to outrun the feeling of being nothing. But there is one force the ego cannot survive. Not criticism, not failure, not even death itself. Humility, because humility is not self-deprecation. It is not shrinking. It is not submission. Humility is truth. The kind of truth that shatters illusions. The kind that doesn't seek applause. The kind that doesn't need to win because it already knows what it is. And that truth is terrifying to the ego because the ego is built on performance. It feeds on identity. It survives through separation. Me versus them. Success versus failure. Worthy versus unworthy. But humility sees through that illusion. It sees the game for what it is, a desperate attempt to feel significant in a world that cannot remember your name. You think your resume matters to the stars. You think your followers impress the ocean. You think your accolades echo. In the bones of time, they don't. Because the universe does not respond to titles. It responds to presence. And presence is born only through the death of ego. But death is painful, and so we avoid it. We build our lives on distraction, on noise, on achievement, on comparison. Anything to avoid the quiet truth that we're not as powerful, not as special, not as invincible as we pretend to be. And yet in that very truth lies our freedom. Because when you let the ego die, not once, but over and over again, something extraordinary happens. You remember who you were before the world told you who to be. You remember that greatness is not in being above others, but in being no one at all, so that the truth of everything can pass through you undistorted. You stop trying to prove your worth and start embodying it. You stop needing to be seen and start seeing. And that is what humility gives you. Vision not outward, but inward. It reveals the shadow, the pride, the fear, the control. It strips away the disguise of superiority and reveals the trembling human beneath. And in that trembling, there's power, not dominance, presence. Because the most powerful person in the room is never the loudest. It's the one who has nothing to protect. The one who has faced their demons and made peace. The one who no longer needs to win because they've already surrendered. Not to defeat, but to truth. That's what humility does. It doesn't break you. It brings you back to your knees, not in weakness, but in reverence. Reverence for the mystery, for the fragility of life, for the beauty of being small in a universe too vast to comprehend. This isn't about thinking less of yourself. It's about thinking of yourself less so you can finally see the pain behind another's anger, the fear behind their pride, the cry for love behind their arrogance, because ego separates. But humility connects, and connection, real, raw, soul, deep connection, is the only thing that has ever healed anything. But you cannot connect while you perform. You cannot love while you compete. You cannot awaken while you protect your image. You must descend into the cracks, into the parts you denied, judged, abandoned. Because the path to true power is not upward. It is downward into the underworld of your own shadow. And only the humble dare enter. Because they know there is nothing to fear in the dark except the parts of yourself you refuse to love. And when you love them, really love them, the ego begins to dissolve, not in shame, but in all, because it realizes it was never the source of your power, only the barrier. And as the ego fades, a deeper force rises, one that doesn't speak in boast or beg for attention, one that simply is still present, unshakable. And in that presence, there is no need for titles, for validation, for applause. There is only truth. And truth whispered in humility roars louder than any ego ever could. And now you begin to see clearly the war was never outside of you. It wasn't with the world. It wasn't with the critics. It wasn't with the people who doubted you, overlooked you, underestimated you. The war was with the false self, the fragile kingdom, the ego built to protect you from a truth it didn't think you could handle. The truth that you are not separate, that you are not better, not worse, not chosen, not cursed, just human, utterly divinely human, made of stardust and sorrow, of ambition and ache, of brilliance and brokenness all at once. And when that truth finally pierces your defenses, it doesn't destroy you. It liberates you, because humility is not humiliation. Humiliation wounds the ego. Humility heals the soul. It is the sacred unlearning of every lie you believed about what made you worthy. It is the returning to center, not the center of attention, but the center of being. The part of you that was holed before the trophies, before the trauma, before the endless quest to be seen. And here's the paradox. The ego cannot stand. When you stop trying to be special, you finally become real. And reality is where the soul lives. Not in the performance, not in the praise, but in the stillness of being true. Because the real ones, the grounded, powerful, deeply alive ones, they don't carry ego. They carry presence. They carry weight. They carry truth. And truth doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to convince or conquer or compete. It just is like a mountain, like an ocean, like the breath you didn't notice until now. You begin to notice everything. In fact, because humility awakens you to the beauty in things you once rushed past, to the wisdom in the words you once dismissed, to the humanity in the people you once judged. You start to see with new eyes, not the eyes of ambition, but the eyes of reverence. You stop asking, how can I win, and start asking, what can I learn? You stop demanding, what do I deserve, and start whispering, what can I serve, because humility is not the death of greatness. It's the beginning of it. The kind of greatness that cannot be measured in likes or trophies or titles. The kind that lives in the quiet impact. The unseen acts of compassion, the truth. Spoken gently in a room of noise, the strength to say, I don't know, when the world expects you to have all the answers. This is the greatness that lasts. This is the greatness the soul came for. And of the ego, it can never give you that. It can give you a throne, but it will always be empty. It can give you applause, but never peace. It can give you power, but only over others, never over yourself. But humility, it gives you sovereignty, the kind that cannot be taken, the kind that doesn't rise and fall with reputation, the kind that stands quietly, steadily in the truth of who you are, even when the whole world forgets. This is the silent strength of those who no longer need to prove. The warriors who have traded their armor for authenticity. The leaders who no longer climb ladders because they've become the foundation. The souls who do not seek the light because they are the light. And it all begins not with ego, but with the courage to kneel not in defeat, in devotion to something greater, to something deeper, to something true. And it's in that devotion, quiet, unwavering, that your life begins to transform. Because once the ego no longer holds the throne, the real work begins. Not the work of conquest, not the endless grind for recognition, but the sacred work of remembrance. You begin to remember what matters. Not the image, but the impact. Not the spotlight, but the soul. Not how loudly you speak, but how deeply you listen. You remember that greatness isn't in being known. It's in being knowing. Knowing when to act and when to be still. Knowing when to lead and when to follow. Knowing when to fight and when to forgive. And that knowing, it doesn't come from a mind. It comes from presence, from humility, from the quiet alignment between your actions and your essence. Because the loudest voice in the world means nothing if it's out of sync with truth. But the whisper spoken in integrity, it reshapes reality. This is what the ancient mystics knew, what Jung understood, what the Stoics lived, what the awakened embody, that the most dangerous man in the room is not the one with the most power, It's the one who has nothing to prove because he's already faced his own shadow. And he didn't flinch. He didn't hide behind charm or intellect or dominance. He stared it down. He embraced it. He integrated it, and in doing so, he became whole. That wholeness it radiates. It speaks before you enter the room. It calms storms with a glance. It disrupts systems simply by existing because nothing threatens the status quo like a man, a woman, a soul who is no longer controlled by their ego. They don't chase validation. They don't fear rejection. They don't cling to identity. They simply live boldly, quietly, unshakably because they know who they are and, more importantly, who they are not. They're not the mask, not the brand, not the applause, not the title. They are the awareness behind it all. And that awareness, that is where humility lives. Not in weakness, but in depth. Not in submission, but in strength. Not in thinking less of yourself, but in thinking of yourself as a part of something much vaster and no more or less important than any other piece. Because in humility, you become the vessel for truth, for service, for transformation. You don't need to dominate the room because you are the room. You don't need to be the loudest voice because truth doesn't shout. It resonates. And it is this resonance born from humility, grounded in self-awareness, that will make your life undeniable, not fleshy, not performative. Undeniable because there's a presence that can't be taught, a depth that can't be copied, a wisdom that only comes when you have died to your ego and risen in your truth. This is not the end of your journey. This is where it truly begins. Because once humility takes root, it doesn't just change how you walk into a room. It changes why you walk in it all. You're no longer moved by the compulsion to be seen. You're moved by purpose, by alignment, by something deeper than ambition, something sacred. You begin to understand that legacy is not what you leave behind when you die. It's what you embody while you live. And that embodiment cannot be faked. It comes from hours spent in the fire of your own becoming. It comes from the tears you cried in silence when no one was watching. From the nights your ego screamed to be saved and you chose stillness. From the moments you could have postured, but instead told the truth. And in the truth, that's what humility really is. It's not about being less than. It's about being exactly what you are. No more, no less. It's knowing your shadow and not letting it drive. Knowing your brilliance and not needing it to shine louder than your presence. Knowing your limits and meeting them with grace, not shame. And suddenly the game changes. You stop measuring your value by outcomes. You stop racing against ghosts. You stop needing others to mirror your worth because your worth is no longer a question. It's a knowing, quiet, immutable, complete. From this space, discipline becomes devotion, not to ego, but to essence. Your actions are no longer a performance. They are an offering. Your work is no longer a strategy. It is service. And your life becomes art. Not the kind that decorates, the kind that awakens. Because when you live from humility, you live from center. You become the eye of the storm, the ground in a world of tremble. The one who does not flinch, not because they are hard, but because they are soft where it matters most. And that softness, that inner surrender, it makes you dangerous in the best way. Because the world cannot control what it cannot tempt. It cannot manipulate what it cannot flatter. It cannot own what it cannot seduce with fear or fame. You become untouchable, not because you are armored, but because you are real, fully human, fully present, fully here, not seeking escape, but embodiment, not avoiding the weight of life, but carrying it with reverence. This is humility, not an accessory to greatness, the foundation of it. Because only when you no longer need to be important can you do work that truly is. Only when you release the obsession with being remembered can you begin to live in a way that deserves remembrance. And only when you bow not to others but to truth itself do you rise into the version of yourself that was never built to only revealed. And in that revelation, you stop being a name. You become a presence, one the world cannot ignore because it does not come from the world. It comes from beyond it. It comes from the place all truth is born. And it speaks not in noise, not in pride, not in conquest, but in stillness, in conviction, in the silent, sacred power of a soul that has nothing to prove and everything to give. And now you walk not to arrive, but to embody. Each step no longer a chase, but a choice. A choice to move in truth, to carry something heavier than ego, and yet far more weightless than pride. Responsibility. The responsibility to live as one who has remembered that the world doesn't need more noise. It needs more clarity. It needs more souls who have surrendered their need to be impressive in order to be impactful. Because when you finally surrender the image, you inherit the influence. Not the influence of popularity, but of depth. Not the influence of platform, but of presence, and presence grounded in humility cannot be replicated. It cuts through the superficial. It disrupts illusions. It calls people back to something they've forgotten. The pulse of the real. You'll notice it in the way your words start to land. Not because you speak louder, but because they're cleaner, less dressed, less coded, more rooted in the experience of one who has been shattered and stood back up, not with bravado, but with grace. You don't need to claim authority when you live a line. You are authority not through control, but through congruence. And the world recognizes congruence, even if it doesn't always understand it. Because deep down, every person is aching for something real. And the real only comes through humility. This is why the ego resists it. The ego wants the appearance of transformation, not the cost. It wants the quote, not the excavation. It wants to seem wise, not become it. But a humility doesn't want to seem. It wants to see. It wants to touch the ground of being, to kneel in the temple of truth, to shed every layer of false light until what's left is raw and radiant. And in that radiance, there is no competition, no comparing, no envy, only the quiet knowing. I am where I'm meant to be. I am who I'm meant to be. And I need no witness to validate that. That's the inner emancipation. You no longer need to control the story. You no longer fear falling because you've made peace with the ground. You've realized that rock bottom isn't the end. It's the altar, the place where the ego dies and the self is reborn. And when you rise from that altar barefoot, breathless, battered, you rise clean. You rise without needing applause, without seeking attention, without bending your spine for scraps of approval. You rise because you remember you never needed to be seen. You only needed to see yourself clearly, to see others without judgment, to see life not as a stage, but as a sanctuary. And that shift changes everything, because now every act becomes sacred, not for display, but for devotion. Every conversation a chance to serve. Every silence a chance to listen. Every breath a chance to return to stillness, to soul, to center. And in that center, there is no ego. Only essence, and essence yours, mine, all of ours is what the world is starved for. Not more leaders, not more voices, more essence. And only the humble can carry it. Only the humble can become vessels, not for glory, but for grace. Not to be celebrated, but to be useful. Because in the end, that's what the ego fears most. Not being hated, being irrelevant. And humility embraces that irrelevance. It smiles at it because it knows to the soul irrelevance to the world is not death. It is freedom. It is proof that you have finally fully become what you were always meant to be. True, whole, free. Free not as an untethered, but anchored in something far deeper than status. Free not as in detached, but devoted to what is real. Free not as in above others, but finally beside them, eye to eye, heart to heart, soul to soul. You see now, humility doesn't strip you of your power. It reveals its truest form. Because when you're no longer driven by the ego's hunger to be right, to be first, to be adored, what's left is clarity. The clarity to act without needing credit. The clarity to speak without needing echo. The clarity to give even when no one is watching. That's where the sacred work begins. Not in stages, not in lights, but in the invisible moments. The moments that won't go viral. The moments that won't be captured or remembered. The moments where you choose truth over pride, presence over performance, grace over power. It's in those unseen choices that the real revolution lives. And the irony, the deeper you move into humility, the more magnetic you become. Not because you're trying to attract, but because people can feel what's real. They can sense when someone has died to their need to impress. They can sense when someone's authority comes not from bravado, but from having bled in the dark and come back clean. That kind of presence, the humble kind, it rearranges rooms. It quiets noise. It makes space not by force, but by integrity. And integrity is rare because it's costly. It costs the part of you that wants to be seen as perfect, the part that fears being misunderstood, the part that wants to control the narrative. But once you let it go, once you let yourself be misunderstood, misjudged, unrecognized, you become untouchable. Because what can the world take from someone who no longer needs its approval? What can they offer someone who already knows their worth? What can they threaten someone who has made peace with the silence? Nothing. And in that nothing, there is everything. Because now you're led not by fear, but by essence. You speak not to prove, but to pour. You move not to dominate, but to deliver. You live not to impress, but to impact. And the impact of a life lived in humility is impossible to calculate because it doesn't make waves, it makes roots. It doesn't explode, it transforms. One room, one conversation, one presence at a time. And in a world obsessed with being louder, faster, shinier, the one who walks in stillness, in reverence, in quiet truth, that one becomes unforgettable. Not because they demand it, but because they don't. And in that final surrender of image, of control, of ego, you don't vanish. You arrive fully, finally, fiercely as who you were before the world told you who to be. Before the performance, before the mask, before the climb, you arrive as truth wrapped in skin, as soul that doesn't need spotlight, as power that bows not in defeat, but in divinity. And when you bow like that, the world doesn't just take notice. It remembers something sacred in itself, because your humility has become a mirror. And in that reflection, others finally see their own light again. Not the one built for applause, but the one born to heal. So now, after everything has fallen away, the applause, the image, the armor, you are left with only this, a breath, a body, a soul. No more roles to play. No more masks to hold. Just presence, just truth, just you. And it is here in the stillness you once feared that you finally find peace. Because there is no peace in being admired, no peace in being right, no peace in winning a game that was never meant to fulfill you. There is only peace in returning. Returning to who you were before the ego was afraid. Before the world demanded you be something more than human. Before you forgot that you were already enough. This is why humility is the ego's greatest enemy. Because it is the soul's only door back home. And now that you have walked through it, you are free. Free to speak only what is true. Free to give without the need to be seen. Free to live without fear of being forgotten. Because what is real in you, what is humble, grounded, sacred cannot be forgotten. It will echo through every space you enter. It will linger in the silence after your words. It will ripple quietly, eternally, not as a legacy of ego, but as a legacy of truth. This is the life that cannot be taken from you. Not because it's protected, but because it's offered. Offered fully, offered freely, offered without condition or disguise. And that offering that is your power, humble, silent, unshakable forever.